Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm Sam Albanese from the National Weather Service. To start with, we do have a winter storm warning for heavy snow up through the White Pass area just north of Skagway and Haines. Expecting anywhere from nearly up to a foot of snow by late tonight and then a few more inches tomorrow for storm totals of nearing about 15 to 17 inches. So pretty snowy conditions there, wet, heavy snow as well, so it could be a slow process in the snow removal. Let's take a look at our satellite imagery and see what's going on around the state. To start with, we're looking at the satellite imagery over the North Pacific, and not that this has anything to do with Southeast Alaska, but it kind of ties together. We have a system that's basically been staying just south of the Aleutian Islands, and the jet stream kind of comes across supporting this system, shooting into the Gulf of Alaska, which is feeding moisture into that system that's dumping the snow in the northern panhandle, as well as rain throughout much of the remainder of the panhandle. But taking a look at this one more time, you can kind of see how we have a lot of moisture that's staying just south of the Aleutian Islands, the main low pressure area. This system is going to slowly be moving to the east through the next several days. Taking a look now at the satellite imagery over the state of Alaska. First, we'll focus on southeast Alaska. Here you can see this plume of moisture that's just pushing up over southeast Alaska. Rain heavy at times throughout the majority of the panhandle. Snow in the White Pass area, Chilkoot and White Pass. Very snowy conditions there. Snow levels, generally speaking, right around the 2,500 foot level in that northern panhandle. Very rainy conditions elsewhere. Running the loop one more time. Different story over the south central and southwestern part of the state. As you can see, not much in the way of clouds. Clouds are basically limited to the eastern portion of the state and then the northern portions of Alaska, which takes us to our surface map around the state today. Southeast Alaska, that's the big story right now. Rainy conditions, moderate to heavy rainfall throughout much of southeast Alaska. Very snowy conditions up through the pass. And then along the North Gulf Coast, basically it's pretty sharp delineation between where the precipitation is and where it isn't. Prince William Sound was basically out of the crosshairs of the precipitation. Even the Copper River Basin, there were some clouds up in there, but that was about it. And more than anything in the Copper River Basin, there was some foggy conditions as well. We had this stationary Arctic frontal boundary basically along the Alaska Range, some scattered snow showers on the range and to the north. Now up into the interior and the Arctic coastal areas, low pressure just off the coast of Barrow with the front extending down through the interior with the low pressure over the central interior. Not a lot going on with this system. It did produce a fair amount of snow yesterday as it crossed the Seward Peninsula region, but some snow showers associated with that, some snow in the central interior. Changing our focus now to the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. As I said during my discussion about the satellite imagery, some moisture coming across the eastern Aleutian Islands, some rain was reported there. Otherwise, generally cloudy conditions over the central to western Aleutian Islands with some rain showers in the extreme western Aleutian Islands. And then in the Bering Sea itself, some snow showers along this trailing cold front from our low pressure system off the coast of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. By tonight, our system dissipates in place essentially over southeast Alaska. You get a lee side troughing, the low forming up into the interior. But the important thing to remember with this is even though the low and the front aren't there anymore, continued onshore push, moderate to heavy rainfall can be expected throughout southern southeast Alaska and the central panhandle. A mixture of snow as you move further north with that snow continuing up through the Chilkoot White Pass area. Rainy conditions in the Yakutat area, possibly mixed with snow much further inland. over the south central region and the eastern interior right on over to southwestern Alaska. Clear, cool conditions tonight, as you would expect typically with these clear skies overnight, radiational cooling, you get your fog, especially in the valleys. Across the interior, we have basically what's left of that frontal boundary. It's a trough extending through the interior. Some snow can be expected over the central interior. Not much in the way of accumulations, an inch or less. Same thing up towards the Arctic coast, Barrow West. Some light snow is possible there as well. In the Bering Sea, generally, the rule across the Bering Sea is pretty windy conditions, but not much in the way of precipitation. You may see some rain over the central Aleutian Islands. The eastern Aleutian Islands should dry out a bit, but still remain windy and cloudy. And the Alaska Peninsula will be on the fringe of the cloud shield with these systems. Taking a look at the forecast now for Wednesday. Another low pressure system is moving on up towards southeast Alaska. Basically, like I talked about yesterday, you keep getting these lows that are forming from this main parent low that's south of the Aleutian Islands, and they're pushing those lows right on up into southeast Alaska. Onshore flow, moist conditions, very rainy conditions are going to persist throughout southeast Alaska with snow persisting in that northern panhandle. By late in the afternoon to early evening hours, expect that snow to be ending, but again, some pretty significant accumulations are expected there. The rainfall in southern and the remainder of the panhandle is should be heavy enough that you're going to need to start worrying about the potential for landslides and even the possibility for some small stream flooding across those areas. Sunny conditions across the southern mainland over towards the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast and Bristol Bay. Cloudy conditions north of that with this front still hanging down into the interior, kind of stalling in place. Some snow showers along that cold front, snow showers up along the Arctic coast from Barrow east to the west, generally just cloudy conditions. And in the Aleutian Islands, again, this flow of moisture coming from that low south of the Aleutian Islands is going to keep the threat for rain over the central Aleutian Islands, with possibly a mixture of rain and snow as you get a little bit further to the west. Take a look at the forecast now for Thursday. Southeast Alaska continuing to see rain, although it will be diminishing in intensity. There's some rain and snow mix possible on the North Gulf Coast. Even in the south central region, we may actually see some snow over the Cook Inlet, Susitna Valley, Anchorage area. Right now it's a little bit iffy, but with this type of a pattern, there's the potential for it, and we'll be monitoring for that. Some snow showers along this frontal boundary through the eastern interior on up to the Arctic coast. Sunny conditions behind that, basically from the Alaska Range west to the Bering Sea coast. Along the Alaska Peninsula itself, as you have this occluded front moving on up to where the Arctic frontal boundary is, some overrunning of precipitation, mixed rain and snow is expected across that region to the eastern Aleutian Islands. And then as we get further out to the west into the western Aleutian Islands, some snow showers can be expected there, along with some rather windy conditions. Temperatures around the state today in southeast Alaska in the 40s, except up into the pass, low 30s there. 30s and 40s along the North Gulf Coast, 20s as you move on up into the Cook Inlet region, single digits in the Copper River to the teens in the Susitna Valley, single digits above and below zero in the eastern interior to right around 10 degrees as you move over the central interior, moving on up to the Arctic coast. There we go. Temperatures generally below zero throughout much of the Arctic coastal area. Over towards the Kotzebue Sound area, single digits above and below zero there. Same thing for the Norton Sound area, and down to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, although right along the coast in the teens there. Down to southwestern Alaska and the Bristol Bay area in the 20s to low 30s. 30s along the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutian Islands, as well as the Pribilof Islands, with 30-degree readings throughout much of the Aleutian Islands, except for AKwx, where temperatures were up to about 43. For our lows tonight, expect temperatures in the Panhandle to be basically in the pretty much steady state, not really dropping much, upper 30s to low 40s, mid 40s in some areas. In the pass itself, northern Panhandle, low to mid 30s there. Along the North Gulf Coast and the south central region, temperatures will be dropping tonight into the teens and single digits across some of those areas, near 10 below in the Glen Allen area. Temperatures in the eastern interior below zero, same thing up along the Arctic coast, sub-zero readings throughout much of that region down to the Kotzebue Sound area and Norton Sound. Temperatures right a little bit above to a little bit below zero in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta to the teens as we move on down to Bristol Bay. 20s and 30s across the Alaska Peninsula to the mid 30s in the eastern Aleutian Islands, just below freezing in the Pribilof Islands at 31. and along the Aleutian Islands themselves in the mid to upper 30s is what you can expect for lows tonight. Tomorrow, high temperatures in southeast Alaska, 40s to low 50s, except for up into the Chilkoot White Path area where it'll stay below freezing there. Temperatures along the North Gulf Coast generally in the 20s and 30s. Temperatures in the single digits as you move on up into the interior in the Copper River Basin. Teens on the north side of the Alaska Range, single digits up into the eastern interior, staying below 0 along the Arctic coast to Kotzebue Sound. Single digits over southwestern Alaska, well, particularly the Yukon Delta. 20s in the Bristol Bay area to the 30s to low 40s over the Alaska Peninsula to the eastern Aleutian Islands. Temperatures staying in the low 30s in the Pribilof Islands, and temperatures in the low 40s to upper 30s over the remainder of the Aleutian Islands. For our flying weather tomorrow, expect marginal to IFR conditions throughout southeast Alaska. IFR definitely in the Chilkoot White Path area to marginal conditions along the North Gulf Coast. Marginal conditions up into the interior associated with those areas of light snow to IFR along the Arctic coast itself, and then also into the Bering Sea. Generally marginal conditions throughout much of the Bering Sea with some IFR conditions over the central Aleutian Islands tomorrow. For our passes, marginal conditions for Anaktuvik as well as Adigan Path. Down to the Alaska Range, expect VFR conditions for Lake Clark and Merrill Path, as well as Rainy Path and Windy Pass. Continuing along the Alaska Range, expect VFR conditions for both Isabel and Mentasta Path, and also expect VFR conditions down in the Chugach Mountains and Todnita Path, as well as Portage Path. And then as we move over to southeast Alaska with the heavy snow there, IFR conditions to low IFR conditions are what you should expect tomorrow through both Chilkoot and White Path. Freezing levels at the surface throughout the mainland, sloping to about 6,000 feet in southern southeast Alaska to about 1,000 feet across the Alaska Peninsula as well as the Aleutian Islands. For icing tomorrow, widespread moderate mixed icing is what you should expect, especially in the southern panhandle on up to the northern panhandle and that North Gulf Coast. And then out into the Aleutian Islands, expect some isolated moderate rime icing basically over the central Aleutian Island from your freezing level to 12,000 feet there, and in southeast to 13,000 feet. Excuse me. Jet stream tomorrow starts off at about 140 knots coming off of northern Japan, 160 knots south of that storm system, south of the Aleutian Islands, drops off to 60 knots as it comes south of the Gulf of Alaska to 70 knots over the Yukon Territory, and then 75 knots down along the Rocky Mountains. Taking a look down to the 9,000 foot level, expect some moderately strong winds in the panhandle, about 35 knot winds there throughout much of southeast Alaska. 20 knot winds right along the North Gulf Coast, light winds over the eastern interior to the eastern Arctic coast, 15 to 20 knot winds coming down across the western interior to about 25 knot winds coming down through the Bering Strait, increasing to about 35 to 40 knots over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast, to 45 knots as we get down towards the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutian Islands, with winds at the 9,000 foot level about 30 to 45 knots across the central to western Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Taking a look down to the 3,000 foot level, southeast Alaska, some pretty strong winds there, 35 to 40 knot winds throughout the panhandle, 15 knots along that North Gulf Coast, light and variable winds over the mainland, 20 knot winds along the Arctic coast itself, 30 knot winds coming down through the Bering Strait, to 35 knot winds over the Bering Sea coast and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, 30 knot winds across the Alaska Peninsula. Winds are considerably stronger over the Bering Sea, about 30 to 40 knot winds there to 45 knot winds over the central Aleutian Islands, and about 35 to 40 knot winds over the western Aleutian Islands at that 3,000 foot level. For turbulence, expect some widespread moderate turbulence below 3,000 feet in the panhandle, isolated to scattered turbulence below 3,000 feet over much of the northern panhandle, and out across the southwestern Alaska, expect some isolated moderate turbulence from Bristol Bay across the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands below 3,000 feet, and some isolated moderate turbulence up near the Seward Peninsula below 3,000 feet as well. And that wraps up this portion of the show. Enjoy this segment and come back for the marine forecast.
During the past week, you have probably heard at least one news story about a missing hiker, a fisherman, or a pilot and passengers. If that missing person is someday you, the next 7 minutes, the length of this video, can make a difference in whether you live or die. Two experts on survival, Captain Pete Savage and Warrant Officer Steve Lewis of the Alaska Army National Guard, have 7 steps to follow if you ever find yourself stranded in the wilderness. The 7 steps to survival are recognition, inventory, signaling, shelter, water, food, and play.
Hey, when you ever find yourself in a survival situation, you kind of want to think of the 7 steps of survival to kind of get you in the right flow and get you moving in the right direction to successfully survive a situation that you might not otherwise do. Recognition is probably one of the most important steps in a survival situation, because that's knowing that you're getting yourself into a bad situation and going, hey, am I starting to get hypothermic? Am I cold? Am I lost? Am I somewhere I shouldn't be? And do I need to hunker down for the night? And so make sure that I can survive the night and survive the next couple of days, if that's how long it's going to take me to get out of this specific situation or to get rescued.
The second step to survival is inventory. That's checking every pocket, bag, and the surrounding area for anything that can help you survive.
Inventory is also very important, because there's been some instances I've read about up in Fairbanks where a lady was with her couple of kids, and she was out for, I don't remember the specific amount of time, but it was significant, and she couldn't start a fire because she didn't have any matches. And then when she was at home going through her stuff to throw it in the wash, I heard she came up with a little lighter in her pocket she didn't even know about. And the situation could be even worse than that. So make sure you check all your pockets, check all your survival gear and all the little pockets in your pack and so on. Look for anything that might be useful, and never throw anything away. You can imagine that a safety clip might seem insignificant at one point, but a day later it could be something to tie your jacket back together if a zipper broke. You basically have active signals, like your flares and smoke signals and fires and so on, that take a moderate amount of work to keep going, whereas your passive signals, your panel markers, VS-17s, and so on, you just lay out. And
Lewis says a key thing to remember about active signals is to make sure that before you use them, an airplane or search party is close enough to see the
I've
signal.
heard lots of situations where people pop their smoke or pop their flares, and there's no planes or anybody around to see it. And then they're gone when the plane does fly by. And a plane could fly right over the top of us right now. And if we didn't have a way to signal them, we'd be out of luck.
Shelter is the 4th step to survival, and Savage and Lewis show us how to construct a lean-to using just natural vegetation, common to many areas in Alaska.
Here you have a lean-to shelter using skunk cabbage leaves like shingles to dissipate water from the roof of an improvised shelter. Not only can you use natural vegetation, but you can use water-repellent materials such as a poncho, visqueen, even the skin of a plane can be used in a shingle-type fashion. These are very water-repellent, and they are very good natural vegetation. You'll find them in a lot of low-lying areas. You also have pine boughs that we can use. They'll break the wind from entering the shelter. I'm going to stay warm and dry. That's the biggest thing. This primarily keeps me dry from the wet ground. I put it on. One match here, get it down here. You start with small kindling and tinder, and you make sure that gets going good. Okay, once I've got my fire started, it dissipates most of the bugs. It throws a little heat this way into the shelter. I want to block maybe any wind coming in with my big leaves from the skunk cabbage. I can either use that or boughs. Take the bivy sack, put it on up over my shoulder, and now I can lie down and rest.
Your body can't function very long without water, so the 5th step to survival is water collection. Savage explains how to collect and purify water in the wilderness.
We have a number of items set up, like a poncho catch basin, which water comes down as it comes down from the sky as rain, catches in a basin that's made from your poncho, and it filters out through the neck of the poncho, where you can either have a canteen at the bottom where you can catch that water for drinkable water. You can also use water out of streams. The only problem is that some of the streams have algae and bacteria in them that can make you sick. So they do make filters now, like Kakadin water filters, which are ceramic filters. It'll screen some of the microorganisms in the water so that it won't affect you, that are fairly small and miniaturized that you can put in a survival kit. They also make tablets that'll actually kill the bacteria or the microorganisms in the water, but you're still drinking it without a filtration system.
As your animal comes across here and trips this thing here, it pops down and the rock hits the animal. And voila, dinner.
Food is an obvious component of survival, but keeping a high morale is also important. Savage and Lewis combine the final two steps for survival, food and play, into one, showing how to make the search for food fun.
What I have is I'll have a rope with a little stick tied on the back of it. What I do is I just stick it through here, through the little inverted A you have here, and it basically locks back there real easy. And what then you do is you take this and kind of turn it down so that you can stick a trigger stick under there that will just barely hold it back there rather than really severely holding it back there. You stick the stick back there. Then this little triggering device is where you're going to have your food, and the animal just has to just barely touch the food, and the rock comes dropping down.
What you see here is a rabbit coming down the game trail. He'll look at the snare that has the piece of peanut butter. My hand, being the animal, will go ahead and grab the bait stick where the morsel is, and he thinks he's going to get away with it, but as he trips it, he gets caught. I'm caught on the wire. You can see this wire here, that's to the stick, and I can't get away.
Welcome back, and now let's take a look at our marine forecast for Southeast Alaska. Taking a look at the forecast for Monday. Pretty strong winds in the southern inside waters, just like yesterday, 35 to 45 knot winds out of the southeast. South winds 30 knots up through that Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay area. Southern outside waters not nearly as strong, at least in the extreme southern part of the region, southwest 30 knots there. 40 knot winds just off the southern end of the Sitka area. 25 knot winds out of the south just off Gustavus, with east winds 20 knots along that east Gulf Coast. By Thursday, winds are going to drop off just a little bit in the panhandle, at least in the southern panhandle, down to 35 knots, but still gale force winds in those southern inside waters, 25 knot winds up through the Lynn Canal and Glacier Bay area. South winds about 20 to 25 knots off the coast of the panhandle, with southeast winds 20 knots as you get up along that east Gulf Coast. For the south central region on Wednesday, expect northeast winds from Prince William Sound down across Kodiak Island, 15 to 20 knots over by the Sound, increasing to about 25 knots as you move on down to Kodiak Island, as well as the Barren Island region. North winds 25 knots in the southern Cook Inlet region, with 10 knots in the northern Cook Inlet region. By Thursday, winds are going to become more of a southeast to east component along the North Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound, around 25 knots. Then 30 knot winds out of the east-southeast around Kodiak Island. Northeast winds coming down through the Augustine area and Shelikof Strait at 30 knots. North winds 25 knots in the southern Cook Inlet region, with 15 knot north winds in the northern Cook Inlet region. For the Alaska Peninsula on Wednesday, expect your winds to be northeast throughout the entire region. 30 knots in Bristol Bay, 30 knots south of the eastern peninsula, 35 to 40 knots over the western Alaska Peninsula waters on both the north and south side of the peninsula. By Thursday, we expect the winds to be north from Bristol Bay down to just south of the eastern Alaska Peninsula, about 30 to 35 knots there. Northeast winds 40 knots over the western Alaska Peninsula waters on both the north and south side of the peninsula. For the Aleutian Islands on Wednesday, northeast winds 35 to 40 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands. Same thing for the central to western Aleutian Islands, about 35 to 40 knot winds there. And out over the western Aleutian Islands, expect your winds to be out of the northeast at 35 knots. On Thursday, those winds drop off to 30 knots over the western Aleutian Islands, 35 to 40 knot winds continuing over the central Aleutian Islands out of the northeast, with winds northeast 40 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands. For the Bering Sea coastal waters, for Wednesday, expect your winds to be northeast from the Nunivak Island region right on down through the Pribilof Islands as well as the St. Matthew Island area, about 30 to 35 knots across that region. Up through the St. Lawrence Island region, north winds at 25 knots. For Thursday, those winds will remain north at 25 knots in the St. Lawrence Island region, north winds 30 to 35 knots over the Nunivak Island waters, and northeast winds 40 knots in the Pribilof Islands with 30-knot winds out of the northeast in the St. Matthew Island waters. For the Arctic coastal area on Wednesday, expect your winds outside of Kotzebue Sound to be out of the northwest at 20 knots. Same thing as move on up towards the Point Hope, Cape Lisburne area, dropping off to 15 knots over by Point Lay. And then winds are going to be out of the east about 10 to 15 knots from Barrow east for Wednesday. By Thursday, winds are going to remain east from Barrow to the Barrow east about 10 to 15 knots. Northwesterly winds 15 knots along the northwest Arctic coast, and northwest winds 20 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound as well as over towards the Cape Lisburne, Point Hope area. For a quick recap tonight, the one thing to remember is we do have the heavy snow warning for the White Path area through tomorrow late afternoon, early evening hours. Expect upwards of about 15 to 18 inches of snow there. Rain heavy at times throughout much of southeast Alaska as well as the North Gulf Coast. Over the south central region, clear cold conditions tonight, some fog in the valleys are what you can expect, patchy fog across the southwestern part of the state as well. The northern interior and up to the Arctic coast with this front hanging down through the interior, some snow along that front right on up to the Barrow area. Generally an inch or less is what we're anticipating with that. And then out into the Bering Sea, we have this strong flow pattern out of the northeast. Cloudy conditions along the Alaska Peninsula, some rain possible over the central Aleutian Islands. But we're out of time for the show this evening. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.